introduce Dr. Paul Ortiz, I'd like to thank our donors for the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer in Sunflower County. They are Bings County Market, Cannon Ford Lincoln, Community Bank, Jim Dan, the Department of Mathematics, Computer and Information Sciences at Mississippi Valley State University, Guaranty Bank, Planners Bank, Walmart Supercenter, and Pepsi Americas. Those beautiful t-shirts that you all are wearing, Cannon Ford Lincoln and Guaranty Bank were the sponsors, and the tote bags were courtesy of Community Bank and Planners Bank. So we hope that you all enjoy wearing them and carrying the tote bags around. The 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer in Sunflower County would not have been possible without their generous support. Special thanks to Mount Beulah Missionary Baptist Church for opening their doors to us for the past 10 years. And special thanks goes to the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and the staff. So special thanks to Samuel Proctor Program. Associate Professor Paul Ortiz received his PhD from Duke University in 2000 and his BA from the Evergreen State College in 1990. He joined the University of Florida Department of History in 2008 after teaching at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Professor Ortiz has published and taught in the fields of African American history, Latino studies, the American social movement theory, U.S. history, U.S. South, labor, and documentary studies. He currently works with students in these and related fields. He's also the director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, as I stated before. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Ortiz.
Thank you, Stacy, for a very kind introduction. Stacy asked me this morning to talk about remembering Jim Crow. I wanted to preface this by saying that this will be the very final book event for this edition, for the third edition of Remembering Jim Crow. And these are the last copies in existence. We really had to scramble because the book has been very popular. Remembering Jim Crow, those of you know with the term, it's kind of a prequel to the Civil Rights Movement. It's what happened before the Civil Rights Movement. But every time we put out a new edition, the book almost immediately is used heavily. It's used in family reunions. Many of the African American elders that we interviewed for the book, because it is an oral history book, will order 100 copies for a reunion in Magnolia, Arkansas, or Brinkley, Arkansas, or some other large metropolitan town in the Delta, like Indianola, for example. So the fourth edition is actually coming out in August, and the publisher was in between editions. And so when we contacted, after you asked me about the book signing, I contacted the publisher, and they're like, oh no, we don't have any more copies of this edition. And so this will be, again, the very last event with this particular edition. But what I want to do this morning is read a few of the oral history excerpts out of this book, talk a little bit about how we wrote the book, and the oral history work that went into the creation of the book. But first I want to thank the Indianola Public Library for hosting the event. I want to thank my dear friend Dr. Stacy White for friendship and comradeship over many years. I want to thank the local people of Indianola and Sunflower County and Mississippi for creating and sustaining a centuries-long freedom struggle, which really forms the foundation of this book. And lastly, of course, I want to thank all of the SNCC veterans and Freedom Summer veterans, people who really changed my life when I first began trying to figure out how to change the very troubled world that we live in. I was a labor organizer for a number of years. After I got out of the U.S. Army, and Brother Alan Cooper can relate to this, coming back to the U.S., I joined the United Farm Workers, got arrested, spent some time in jail for that picket line activity. The police did not like us very much, and I know Freedom Summer volunteers and SNCC veterans can relate to that. The book, Remembering Jim Crow, came out of an oral history project that I worked on as a graduate student at Duke University. And this is a collaborative, collective project. Oral history is not an individualistic kind of activity. It's very collaborative. You work with local people, you work with communities, you work with synagogues, mosques, churches, labor unions, community organizations. In fact, this morning, half of our team at the University of Florida were actually at the mayor's house in Indianola, Mayor Steve, and we were talking about our work there. But that's just an example of how to do oral history, you have to blend in, you have to get to know people, and you really have to be welcomed in. And you have to behave in a way that sometimes academics aren't accustomed to. You know, you hear the term ivory tower, and sometimes there's a little bit of isolation. And I remember when Senator Obama was running for the presidency, and some people would say things like, well, he's not really, he's more of a college professor than a person who could be president. And I think what they meant by that was some people, the critics were saying he was too intellectual somehow, right? But oral history, you have to get out there. And I tell people, when I leave the campus of the University of Florida, I leave my professor's cap in my office. And when I go out in the community, and all of our students can tell you this as well, we are students. We are students of the human condition. And when we do oral history, we are not studying people. We are learning from them. So these are not surveys. They're not kind of loaded questions. They're life history questions. The first week I was at Duke in 1993 as a grad student, they sent me out to Eastern North Carolina to do oral histories. I'd never taken an oral history class. I'd never been involved in an oral history program. My background was in radio, and I was doing labor radio when I was working with the United Farm Workers. That's where I learned how to interview people. This was the greatest academic experience of my life. We went all over the South between 1993 and 1996 to do oral histories. We interviewed elders in African American communities. The median age was probably about 75. The emphasis was on the Jim Crow era. It really wasn't, we were trying to get the era before the modern civil rights movement. And so we were really looking for the oldest people we could talk with in each community that we worked in. I'm going to read some excerpts in a few minutes, but we had field sites all over the South. One of the most fascinating to me was in the Arkansas Delta, just across the way. And we were staying in the large town of Fargo, Arkansas. How many of you know where Fargo is? It no longer exists. Many of the towns that we worked in had lost their populations during the Great Migration, World War I, World War II, where people maybe moved out in the 1950s and 60s. But they still had institutions. What was fascinating to me was in Fargo, the office that we worked in had housed the Fargo Agricultural School. The founder of that school had been a Tuskegee Institute graduate, and he was a beloved member of that area. Now, he passed away, and just to give you some idea, the school actually closed in 1949, but it still had the structure. It still had a museum, a working museum, and that was the office that we worked out to do interviews all over that part of the Arkansas Delta. I want to talk a little bit about my family background to give you a sense of what I think prepared me to do this work. Remembering Jim Crow is a oral history book which is composed of about 70 or so oral histories. And I conducted about 25 of the interviews that are in here. But the larger collection contains 1,600 interviews about African American experiences during the Jim Crow era. The field sites included places like Tallahassee, Florida, Durham, North Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina. We had a lot of information about the Wilmington 10 during the Civil Rights Movement, but a lot of information about the Wilmington Massacre in 1898. Other sites, I'm trying to think, Birmingham, Alabama, Macon County, Alabama, we're at Tuskegee. When I was growing up, I grew up with hearing all about Jim Crow. And it was kind of Jim Crow and Juan Crow. My father grew up, I was telling Stacy's sister, in Houston. And my father would tell me about the signs that he grew up with and the rules that he grew up with in the 40s and 50s, where you would go into the white part of town or a white restaurant, and the signs were everywhere. And they would say, no Mexicans, no Negroes, no dogs allowed. And I actually share those with my students, and they're quite shocked. And I asked them to think about the complexity of the Jim Crow system. Who created that sign? Who printed it? Who put it up in their business, whether it was a restaurant or a department store or some other kind of facility? No Mexicans, no Negroes, no dogs allowed. And that was the environment my father grew up in. If you were Mexican American and you worked in the white part of town or the downtown area, you went to work and then you left. And if you were caught in that part of town when the sun went down and you didn't have work, right, you were in big trouble. A lot of young Mexican American youth, when he was growing up, would just disappear. The police had it was essentially open season, right? Houston was a very tough town. In fact, the neighborhood my father grew up in, by the way, we call it Old Fifth Ward. The nickname was the Bloody Fifth. That gives you an idea. It was a Jim Crow town. So I grew up hearing those stories. When I was growing up, my parents divorced when I was about 8, and my stepfather, a white gentleman, moved us to a town called San Leandro, California. And this was a great preparation for this kind of work. San Leandro, California, believe it or not, in the mid-1970s was as Jim Crow as about any town you could go to. It was dominated by the Ku Klux Klan. And in fact, the Department of Justice did an investigation around the time of the bicentennial. And the day after the investigation was made public, I think it was in the Chronicle or one of the big California papers, the headline read, San Leandro, California, the most racist town in America. And this was in 1976. And what had happened was the wealthy folks in the East Bay, in Hayward, had given millions of dollars to the homeowners associations in San Leandro, California, to create what they called a racial deadline, because they didn't want Asian, African American, and Latinos moving in from Oakland over to East Bay. They wanted to keep Hayward an all-white city. So they leaned on their white working class counterparts in San Leandro, and they created these racial covenants. Well, racial covenants were outlawed by this time, as you well know. So San Leandro, that I grew up in as a Hispanic, it was pretty rough. We would walk to school. There weren't many African Americans or Hispanics, and I lived on Marina Boulevard. And from my apartment, we would walk down to Garfield Elementary. It was about a mile walk. And white adults would drive by us and throw things at us. They threw cans, beer bottles, and things like that. And they would say things that as a fourth grader, I had no idea what they were talking about. They would say, go home. We don't want you here, go home. And as a fourth grader, I think, I can't go home, I'm going to school. If I go home, I get in trouble, And we're just like, but we kind of band together. But as a fourth grader, you don't have political consciousness. And so I just thought, older white people are just angry. They're just angry people. What are they angry about? I didn't know at that time. But anyway, so I'm just telling you this because these are some of the experiences that, as a Mexican-American person growing up in this society, I think helped prepare me to do this kind of work. I left the country for 4 years. People were talking about, do you ever think about leaving the country? Well, I did leave the country because I was in the Army, right? I was in the 82nd Airborne and 7th Special Forces between 1982 and 86, and I was in Central America for much of that time during the Civil Wars. And that was a brutal, bloody period of America's history. And when I got back, when you leave the country and you're engaged in something like this, I know Brother Allen can back me up in this, you never really come home. There is no home to come to because your family has changed, your friends have changed, the society has changed.
You were in proxy wars. Bro.
Proxy wars, yeah. And no one wanted to hear what the U.S. was doing in Latin America. No one. But at the same time, Brother Cooper and others, and I didn't know this at the time, were actually coming down to Central America, peace delegations, trying to build solidarity between the U.S. and Central America instead of the wars. But when I got back, what I realized is that this country, in many ways, has layers of corruption that need to be fought. The SNCC organizers in the 60s fought that corruption. And I didn't realize this until I got back, but the first book that was put into my hands by a person who had been involved in SNCC, I really regret I never learned his, I can't remember his name, but when I was telling him about my experiences in Central America, he said, Brad, you got to read this book. I'm going to put this book in your hands. And he went to his bookshelf, got this book, put it in my hands. Wretched of the Earth by Franz Fanon. And I read that book in like a day and a half. It was this amazing experience. And I later on learned that this was a book that was formative during the 1960s, had such a huge impact all over the world, in Latin America and Africa. And this is written by a young military veteran like myself, who had been a colonial occupier like myself, who had seen the deep corruption of his society, and who then decided to join the people who he had been oppressing. And I mention all this history to just, again, to highlight the fact that all of these experiences prepared me to examine the most corrupt of all social, economic, and political systems this country's ever devised. And that corruption, of course, is the Jim Crow system. The Jim Crow system was corrupt from top to bottom. And it was a system which took tremendous energy to organize and to perpetuate. If you imagine, not just separate drinking fountains, separate restrooms, separate pay scales, separate residential areas, the occupational structures of Jim Crow. I have my students read, census data, like Memphis in 1930, here's a snapshot. Railroad engineers, best paid members of the American working class. 168 railroad engineers lived in Memphis, Tennessee in 1930. How many were white? How many were African American? Just a question. How many black railroad engineers do you think there were in Memphis, Tennessee in 1930?
None.
Zero. And I ask my students, well, why is that? And some of them say, occasionally they'll say, and the teachers can smile at this, they'll say, well, education? No, there's no school for railroad engineers in 1930. And you can go all the way down the line. That's why I say Jim Crow was such a complex system. It took so much energy. When people say, well, that's just the way it was back then, the people in this book tell you no, that system had to be constructed and reconstructed and built and rebuilt every single day. It took tremendous energy for the white power structure to keep Jim Crow in place. Well, I'm going to move on to doing a few reading of excerpts. Before I do, I'll explain how I got into Indianola. I was actually, our field site that summer was actually in Greenwood, and we had an office in Mississippi Valley, Dr. White, and we were doing interviews in Itabena, kind of southern LaFleur County, and one day I was assigned to go up and do some interviews with people who had actually participated in Strike City. And on my way back from those interviews, I got lost. This was pre-GPS. I don't even think I had a map. I just was lost. And somehow or the other, I ended up pulling into downtown Indianola to a business called White's Service Station. And I didn't know it at the time, but Dorsey White was quite a historian. And he asked me, I asked for directions, but he said, well, his distinct, deep voice, what are you all doing here? I said, Mr. White, we're gathering histories from African-American elders about the Jim Crow period. He said, well, this town has a lot of history, young man. A lot of history, right? And so he sent me to interview Mrs. Bernice White. And then he said, when I was finished that interview, I was to come back. And he would have further assignments for me. This was in the summer of 1995. And the first thing he told me was, if I wanted to understand Black history in Mississippi, I had to understand how the Masons worked. because he said most black men in the state of Mississippi are involved in either the Masons or some other kind of secret society. And that was the network that he had tapped into. And he would send me out. He would just say, you know, I don't remember the name of a lot of the towns that he would send me to, Stacy. They're very small towns. And he would say, go to this town. Here's the directions. Stop at the first house you see. And tell them that Dorsey sent you. And then he said, the rest is up to you. Okay. So that I was doing, I was doing that for 2 weeks. And my team back at Valley, and these were grad students from Michigan, and I think Berkeley, they're like, what are you doing up there in Indianola? What's that town called? The first time, this just occurred to me, Stacy, the first time I pulled into Indianola, this is what I thought. When I passed the post office, it occurred to me, that was Minnie Cox's post office. And many of you know the story of Mrs. Cox and the struggles that she had as postmistress here, and the involvement of President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. But that was my first thought, you know. But from that time on, I've always felt at home here. I mean, your father was the first person to welcome me into town. This morning, the mayor welcomed us to his house, and we participated there. We've been to several Freedom Summer reunions, and so I mentioned earlier, I never really felt that I had a homecoming coming back to the U.S. After being in the military all those years, but really coming to places like Indianola for me was a homecoming. And to me, this is family, where we're at now. And that's why I bring my students every year, because I want them to have these kinds of experiences where they learn from people. And they learn, on the one hand, about the deep corruption in the society. They also learn about what people have done to try to challenge that, to overturn it, even to be revolutionaries, as Brother Allen talked to us, a group of us, about yesterday. So I want to do just read a few brief excerpts, then open it up for questions. The first excerpt I want to read, and again, most of the individuals that we interviewed were in their mid-70s and older. I'm going to read a few excerpts. These are actually interviews. I mean, one of these I did, but two of these I did not do. But I wanted to highlight a couple of things. One of the big themes that we picked up on in the Mississippi Delta and in the Arkansas Delta was African American and Native American history, and how the two are really one history. And so many people articulated that to us. They said, if you want to learn black history in the Delta, you've got to learn about the history of the Choctaws, the Natchez, the Creeks, and others. And the way Remembering Jim Crow is organized is we would pick excerpts from our interviews. We wouldn't publish the whole interview. We'd find a chunk of the interview that we thought told a really compelling story, and one that could be understood by a general audience. So it was a tough process, though, because again, we had 1,600 interviews to choose from, and we winnowed that down to about 70. The first excerpt I'm going to read is from a lady. Her name is Money Alean Kirby. And when I think about these interviews, I have to pause and pay respect, because most of the individuals that we interviewed in the early 90s have passed away. And now one of the main audiences that we have are their children, our grandchildren. So Money Alean Kirby, she was the person that we interviewed in the Delta. And in the front of each interview, you'll see that we put an explanatory, we call a header, to kind of introduce you to the person. And so this is a portion of Money Kirby's narrative. She says, my mother was part Indian and part Chinese, and her father was full-blooded Indian. So we're a grand mixture of that makeup. Kirby's mother refused to allow race to define her life. In a notable instance, she adopted some needy white children whose parents could not support them. This attempt to test the fabric of racial segregation in her southwestern Arkansas community forced Kirby's mother to draw upon her prowess with a Winchester rifle. And this is her story. My name is Money Alean Kirby, born August 8, 1914. Bisco, Arkansas, on our family's farm. We'd owned that in the family since back through our grandparents. They inherited it as a part of a reservation because they were Indians, and the Indians were in some cases forcibly integrated with blacks. That's how our heritage began. And one thing about the philosophy of our family is that they tolerated but never did accept Jim Crowism, segregation, or subhumanism of any type or any type of these things, those stereotypes that were thrown at blacks, and encouraged that they accept it and all that sort of thing. We never did accept it. We tolerated it. There were instances in which, when I first started to school, we had to walk about a mile. In fact, our farm was approximately a mile from the little town of Biscoe, Arkansas. And of course, we had to walk to town, to school. Just before getting into town, they had built a school specifically for whites. And so it happened that we had some whites to come and live on our farm. He was a logger, he and his family, and he put up a tent there. He had a boy and a girl. Somehow this white fellow and his wife, he ran off and left the woman and 2 children. My mother, being a good Samaritan that she always was, took the children in. The lady came and signed a letter asking her to take care of those children for her until she could go and get with her parents, and then come back and get her children. Of course, Mama took them in, and we kept them in her home. And of course, school started. That created a problem, because we had to go right by the white school, going to the school designated for blacks or coloreds. And Mama simply kind of rode shotgun and carried those kids on down to the school where we were. She said, "They're in my house. I have a letter here signed by their mother saying that they're in my custody." And that old Indian lady marched them right on in school with us. And of course, the black principal, he was excited because he thought maybe the folks were going to create a mob or something of that type. But she stood her ground and carried them on to school with us. That was back there around 1920. Jim was really crowing at that time. Well, as you know, our group has always been integrated against their will. And there were just as many of them kids in there in the black school that were kind of half white looking, as was those white children who stayed with us. They didn't stand out too much. Oh, but the local whites, they turned red and had a whole lot of mouth, but they dared not come out there. Incidentally, my mother was an expert with a 38-40 Winchester. A block away from the house, sitting up in a big oak tree, was a big black bird sitting up on top. And the sheriff had come out there to talk with Mama about all those rumors about how she's got these white kids in the home and all that sort of thing. My mother just happened to have this 38-40 standing out there on her porch. Just happened to have it out there. She said, "I'll tell you what, Sheriff, here's a letter, you read it. These are the kid's mother, and it's signed by her, and I'm going to take care of them. They will be under my custody until she comes back and gets them. I don't want to cause any trouble, but if anyone messes with me, you see that bird sitting up there on the top of that tree down yonder?" He said, "Yes." And she just raised that 38-40 up on her shoulder and squeezed it off, and that bird disappeared. We went down there and picked up a part of his beak and a few feathers, and the sheriff says, "Case closed." He left there and never did come back. I think he passed the word around that that lady has a 16 shooter out there. Don't go on out there and mess with her. The Indians were pretty tough folks, and she was loaded with it. My mother was part Indian and part Chinese, and her father was a full-blooded Indian. So we are a grand mixture of that makeup. And so that was Muddy Kirby. And the theme of Native American history and mixture, racial mixture, in that narrative you hear it as both a strength, but also a source of shame in the sense she said we were always integrated. The myth about segregation was it was about racial separation. That is not true. African Americans of those generations can tell you they knew white people better than white people knew themselves. Right? They worked in white people's houses. They knew intimate details of white families. They knew their deepest secrets. Many African American women taught young white Southern children how to read, how to write. Most importantly, how to interact, how to act human with other people. So the notion about separation, yes, separation from power. SNCC veterans can tell you this. That's what African Americans were separated from. They're separated from the ballot. They were separated from economic security. They were separated from social security, but not in terms of the intimacy between the races. But here, Mrs. Kirby is saying the Native American ancestry and our embrace of it, and even racial mixture, can be a strength. It doesn't have to be something that you're ashamed of. Chinese, Native American, European, African American. So I'm going to read another excerpt that kind of magnifies that as well. Talbert Chisholm was a man that I interviewed, and he was one of our Fargo, Arkansas narrators. We used to say interviewees, and we decided that sounds too much like the CIA or something. Right? So we call them narrators now. People are doing interviews. But Talbert Chisholm was another person from Arkansas. Many of our Arkansas interviews with African American elders talk explicitly about the Trail of Tears, explicitly about genocide against Native Americans. And African Americans told these stories with a very immediacy. And I'll do the brief introduction and just read Mr. Chisholm's narrative. Like many black Southerners, Talbert Chisholm from Fargo, Arkansas, was born into an ethnically diverse family. In this excerpt, Chisholm traces his heritage back to the Choctaw Indians and the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears Indian removal marches in the 1930s. In this tragic episode, Native Americans from the east were forced to relocate to the Oklahoma Territory. One leg of this march passed through the area that eventually became the state of Arkansas. While thousands of American Indians died in the Trail of Tears, a few escaped and mixed with African American communities in Arkansas, Missouri, and other areas west of Mississippi. Talbert Chisholm credits his family's Native American ancestry with helping to create a strong sense of independence. Chisholm also credits the Fargo Agricultural School, founded by Floyd Brown, a graduate of Tuskegee Institute, with teaching black history to its students, thus enhancing black pride. And Floyd Brown was teaching black history to his students. Talbert Chisholm was a student during the Great Depression at Fargo Agricultural School. So that gives you an idea of when he was learning black history. And I'll read the passage here. My grandfather and my father's uncle, the one that I was telling you about, I'll never forget doing this interview. We were sitting outside under a tree, middle of August in the Arkansas Delta. It was 105 in the shade. But Chisholm was such an amazing storyteller. My grandfather and my father's uncle, the one I was telling you about, who was the Molasses Maker, they all migrated about the same time. I think was from Bolivar, Tennessee, over into the state of Arkansas. This uncle of mine, he was mostly Choctaw Indian. His hair was as straight as yours, and here he's talking directly to me. But yet he was dark. They say that what had something to do with that, they told us this kind of undercover, that when they started that great march of the Indians, to move the Indians out of the Delta into Oklahoma, well, the whites made certain agreements with certain Indians that they would settle down in a certain lot of land and become farmers and all of that. They wouldn't have to participate in the migration. And that was the situation that confronted my father's father and his uncle, which was my great-uncle, the Molasses Maker. Many people weren't aware of that. And many people aren't aware that all of that long death march that they performed on the Indians, moving them out of the Delta, where the best land was, out to some other rough land, and what have you, years after that, they said it backfired. And to introduce this next passage, I have to tell you, Talbert Chisholm was a World War II veteran. He served in Patton's Third Army. They said the death march backfired. You know how, don't you? At this point in the interview, he stopped. He looked at me and he said, you know how it backfired, don't you? I was like, I'm not sure what the right answer is. Oil. It was during the time when we were fighting Japan, and Bataan fell, and they had that death march of our United States troops from one place to another. That was a retaliation of what happened to the Indians here in the United States. Now think about it. This man is a war veteran, and he's saying this. And we're doing the interview in 1990. 1995. He says, many people aren't aware of that, never did even give that a thought. Americans are so ignorant of their history, they don't make connections. They're always victims. They don't think about connecting the Trail of Tears with the Sam Death March. In other words, he's teaching me at this point. I'm supposed to be the historian, but he's the one who's teaching me. That was a retaliation of what happened to the Indians here in the United States. Many people aren't aware of that, never did even give that a thought. Something greater than ourselves intervened and kind of gave those who were in power kind of payback for what they had done in the past. Now, I can't get up in a college history class and say that, but I can present Mr. Chisholm's narrative, right? They would enforce the law for whites, but they didn't too much enforce the law for blacks. Because I can remember one time, the story was told there was a fellow that was supposed to have been a deputy that lived out in our community. His name was Clem Simmons. There were some whites had it in it for some of the blacks that lived up in our community. In particular, this uncle of mine was named Forrest Chisholm. And this was a gentleman we heard a lot of stories about when we were in Arkansas Delta. Forrest Chisholm was about half what they call Choctaw Indian and half black, but he was really a marksman with a Winchester or any other kind of gun. And so they had gathered up a posse, had the sheriff with them going to go and get Forrest Chisholm about something or whatever it was. But I think everybody had been alerted in the community because everybody had Winchesters. Every black house in the community at one time had a Winchester in it. And the reason why they did that, a lot of these blacks that came in here and the Indians, like we were talking about from over in Tennessee, the whites could just come in there and run them out, take their crops, house, and everything. But the people they were sponsoring, or that were sponsoring them, were the ones that put a Winchester in every house in the community so that that wouldn't happen. And so this fellow, Clem Simmons, was at the head of the posse, the story goes, and said he held up his hand when they got to a certain point and said, now I tell you, all of those houses in the community that we're going to destroy, they have a Winchester in them, and Forrest Chisholm is the captain, and he really knows how to shoot those guns. I'm afraid that if we go over there interfering with them, that all of this ain't going to come back. It's left entirely up to you now. If you want to go on with it, well, go on with it. But if you don't want to go, and we all stay alive, it'll be best for us to turn right around and go on back up and leave those people alone. They all decided that it would be the best thing to turn around and go back and leave all those black folks alone and not attempt to run them out of the community. I mean, these are no wives' tales. These are things that really happened. That was over in Jericho, Arkansas. Let me read one more excerpt and then open up for questions. I mean, doing these interviews was really, I think it's the greatest experience of my academic life. Talbert Chisholm was a person who he was a community storyteller. I mean, to me, it was like being introduced to Alice Giles here in 1995. People said, if you want to know the history of this community, you've got to talk to Mrs. Giles. And every community has one person or sometimes more, depending on that size of the community. But in Fargo and Brinkley, Arkansas, it was Talbert Chisholm. They'd say, talk to Sergeant Chisholm. He still kept that title from his war years. So the final passage I'm going to read for you is an interview we did with a gentleman. His name is John Harrison Vulture. And before I read that, the book includes the interview excerpts, family photographs that we copied when we were doing the interviews. And in the back of the third edition, is a compact disc. We produced a 4-part radio series, which aired at NPR, I think for the first time, Black History Month in 2001. And now that radio special just kind of has a life of its own. It plays periodically in different NPR affiliates. But you can actually listen to some of the voices that are in the book, not all of them. And then there's also, when the book first came out, to get the CD, you had to pay like $50. But thanks to technology, now you can buy the paperback. And I think today we're offering it for $19 or $20 to make it even, something like that. So that technology has helped us. But anyway, John Harrison Vulture was raised in New Iberia, Louisiana, in the midst of the Great Depression. John Vulture inherited a strong sense of self-determination from his elders. Here, he discusses how his grandfather and his brothers saved the family farm from being stolen by whites during Reconstruction. The story reveals that African Americans understood the larger historical forces at work in the segregating South. And usually when I teach about segregation, I rarely use the term segregation. I use segregating, because segregation was not a static system. I mentioned earlier it was a system you had to build and rebuild every day. So we want to get people to understand how dynamic. Segregation was not a static system. It was always changing. Every time African Americans would resist at one point, the system would adjust to that resistance, the way any kind of status quo system adjusts. Mississippi, and I'll preface this, even though this is in Louisiana, Mississippi had, as far as we know, one of the highest per capita rates of black men in the Union Army during the American Civil War. They fought in some of the pivotal battles. We talk about the Vicksburg campaign. Without African American troops, that campaign could not have been won. That was the campaign that split the Confederacy, right? Battles took place in Memphis, Milliken's Bend. These were African American ex-slave regiments. These men had been slaves up until a few weeks before the battle. And when they went into that battle in Milliken's Bend, they were fighting the finest cavalry troops in the world who came from Texas. And I think Harper's or another Journal sent a reporter down. They said there's no way these young Negroes stand a chance against these elite cavalry troopers. And what the reporter on the site said, a young white northerner, he said that when the former slaves, when the battle started, when they would meet their former masters in the field of battle, they would be so petrified and ashamed, they would walk up to their former master and hand him their musket and say, "I'm sorry, master, please forgive me." That was published the day before Milliken's Bend. That day was the longest bayonet engagement in the entire Civil War. And African American troops at the end won that battle. Not a single one of them handed their musket to their former master. Right? But this is how pivotal that history was. But John Harrison Fulmer takes us into Reconstruction. He says, "My views on a lot of things may be contrary to what other people believe. The Ku Klux Klan was not set up by the lower class of Caucasians. The lower class of Caucasians were recruited into the Ku Klux Klan by former rich plantation owners who saw a way to gain some of their property back. And they used prejudice ideas, class ideas, in these ignorant low-class Caucasians. The act of giving each free slave so many acres of land, and then the Ku Klux Klan scared them off of it, you know. These poor whites that was the body of the Klan didn't gain nothing. The land went back to the rich owner. It didn't go to them. It's just showing you how they manipulated their own people, how shameful that was. During that Reconstruction era, my grandfather spoke of regulators. They called them, or night riders and things like that. My grandfather was a farmer, and he was nobody's pushover, my mother's father. He was the type that would resort to violence to protect what was his. They tried once without success, and so they ended up leaving him alone. There's a cliche. If they can't handle you, then they label you. You know, he was that crazy Negro. So they left him alone. But my mother's father was a man's man. He was kind, gentle. He would give anything to his neighbors, white or black. But you did not push him around, period. I think that's where my mother gets it, you know. My mama was nobody's pushover. You have to realize that the financial backbone of the family was my grandfather. My mother's father was a sugarcane farmer. You see, the Ku Klux Klan were going to fight my grandfather. Then somebody could buy up his farm for a little something, and so the word got back to him what night they were coming. So this is up to this point, this is a classic narrative of land dispossession. We have tens of thousands of these narratives with the Ku Klux Klan in Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, doesn't matter, any state in the South, is mobilized by a wealthy white plantation owner to dispossess small black farmers, and sometimes small white farmers as well. That's why John Vulture says, poor white people didn't get anything out of the Klan. They didn't get any wealth out of it. They were manipulated. They were used. That was something he insisted on us. So he sent my grandmother and all of them away, and in the meantime, his brothers lived like 5 or 6 miles away, and so they came on horseback. He had 3 brothers. I don't care what people say about secrets. These guys planned it, but still the word got back to my grandfather when they were coming. So he sent his family away, and his brothers came over. They loaded their shotguns with birdshot. They hid their horses in the barn, and when they came in the yard, all hell broke loose. But they did not load the shotguns with buckshot, just birdshot, something that would pepper you, you know, and that was the end of that. They peppered them. The white men thought that this was going to be an easy thing. And remember, they had come across the bridge, and they couldn't go out the back way because there was a barbed wire fence. These were all veterans. They had created a situation which would make it hard for their antagonizers to retreat, right? So anyway, the white man thought this was going to be an easy thing, and remember, they had to come across the bridge. They couldn't go out the back way because there was a barbed wire fence. They were just going to ride into the back, get off their horse and everything, but before they could do that, they crossed the fire line and got fired from 4 different directions. Again, these are, I can tell, I don't know this for sure, these are Union Army veterans. These are people that they had essentially set up an ambush. This is during Reconstruction. And I can just about imagine, you know, horses rearing up and everything, and they're just trying to get away from there. But they did not expect that type of reception. They expected a meek little man, and there was nothing meek about my grandfather nor his brothers, in spite of the fact that one of them was a minister. You know, you can't control what people say, right? But John Vulture, the stories are incredibly intense, rich. Those are just 3 of the many excerpts. There's a whole variety of things, and I can, before we leave it, I want to tell you about what's planned next in terms of kind of a sequel to this. But before I do that, I would love to entertain questions or comments or anything from folks. Yes, sir.
I wanted to say something to you about, I read the Jim Crow book, page 107, David Matthews.
Mm-hmm.
He was from Indianola.
Yes, sir.
But what I got from him, excuse me. My name is Charles Riley, everybody, right? I got a master's degree from University of Maryland. I got a bachelor's degree from Jackson State. But what I understand about the history of 1964, I was about this tall then. And what surprised me is right now, in other words, you're gonna have to excuse me. I see more white people, Caucasians in this room than I see blacks. And that's not hurting me. But what I understand about the civil rights days back then, it don't surprise me. It's still going on now. But as far as I see it right now, I understand what's going on. And I'm not surprised. But for the Caucasians in here, thank you. Thank you.
And many of the people that we interviewed,
I think his point is that there should be more black people in here.
Yeah.
That's what I get from him. And I totally agree with it.
And I've been part of the Vietnam War, I was part of the Panama, I was part of the Grenada, and I came back home and I still see the same thing.
yes, sir. And many of the people that we interviewed in 1993, 94, 95, elders in their 80s, the oldest gentleman I interviewed was 104, actually in Gainesville, Florida. What almost every single one of them said that we're giving you these stories because we're really afraid about what's happening now in the society. And remember, this is 1993, 94. They were saying, we feel like we're slipping back. We feel like we made a certain amount of progress, but now we're moving backwards really quickly.
Progress is happening. Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you. Other questions or?
Yes.
Oh,
Just listening to you and reading some of the stories and knowing how difficult many of these stories are. I mean, you are emphasizing to a point how people resisted and were prepared to resist. But on the other hand, there are many stories that leave you with a heavy heart.
Yes.
And
So
so,
Memory Jim Crow is full of those stories.
Yeah.
Yes.
and my question is, how do you keep going? And why do you keep going? To knowing this and absorbing it and disseminating it.
Yeah.
What keeps you going?
Some of the stories, as part of an answer to your question, I encourage everyone in this room, if you haven't already done so, to read a beautiful book by Toni Morrison called Beloved. Beloved is one of the most magnificent books in the history of this country, and she poses this exact same question. There's stories that we have to pass down to our children or grandchildren, but at the end of that magnificent novel, she poses a question, which is, maybe there's some stories that are so painful and so degrading to the human spirit that those stories, maybe we shouldn't pass those down. And that's a question that we wrestle with in oral history all the time. There were stories and there were times in these interviews when we would just have to stop the tape. This is back in the tape cassette, the analog days, right? And, we would be weeping and crying. I remember a lady in I think it was Birmingham, was talking about how her uncle had been lynched during the 1922 coal miners' strike. He was a union organizer. And we had to stop the tape. We were both weeping, and we held hands. It was such a painful story. And she didn't want that story shared with people. And so it didn't go into the book. It didn't even end up in the transcript. Other stories, a lady that I interviewed in Palatka, Florida, her father was a successful African-American building contractor, residential contractor. So successful that during the Great Depression, he employed white workers. But the white contractors were enraged by this, and so they started bombing the family's house. And she said her house was bombed 5 different times in the 1930s. And it was such a painful, and she swore to, or she made me swear to her I would never reveal her name. Because now that she said, now this is 1996, I interviewed her, and she said the same people around, and she was afraid, and she didn't want to be open to a retaliation. So some of these stories are very difficult, but people would tell us over and over again, I know the students can attest to this now, when they are interviewing you or other Freedom Summer volunteers or local people, what you all are telling them is you've got to keep on and tell our story. Tell these stories about how change happens. You've got to know the grimness of the American past to know what you did in the early 60s. Because if you don't know how grim and tragic and corrupt the society was, Freedom Summer doesn't mean anything, right? If Freedom Summer was just about a few reforms here and there, it would just be another story of reform. But it only becomes a dramatic, powerful, heroic story when you realize just how bad things were here. And my God, they were bad. They were so bad that it's almost beyond belief. I mean, the stories last night in that powerful documentary, the doctor who's talking about being raped when she was 11. There are many interviews in our collection of 1,600 interviews of sexual violence. And they're appalling. But the women who told those stories to us told them for a reason. They said, we were shamed into silence for decades, but we want these stories, we want people to know what we endured. And we especially want young people to know. And they insist upon that. And sometimes they feel like people of their own generation, or maybe even middle-aged people, they're not as interested, but they really want high school students, college students, middle school students to know. But some of them are very hard stories. Thank you. Angie? Yes?
I was just remarking on the relation between suffering and shame. And I know in Holocaust survivors, in the stories from the film, and sexual abuse survivors,
Yes.
there is so much shame that you were hurt. And it's just ironic to me.
Yes. And many people that we asked to be interviewed, sometimes we'd be sent out to talk to someone and we would be told that person has so many powerful stories, and they would decline to be interviewed for that very reason. They would say, I would like to share this with you, young man, but it's just too difficult. I don't want to bring up those memories again. I want to let them die in the past. And again, that's why I think in Toni Morrison, that's a constant theme in her, throughout her work. I mean, imagine the story of being a young mother who has risked everything to get your children out of slavery. And then here comes the slave catcher coming to take you back into slavery. And imagine the decision that you would have to make as a young mother at that point in time. It's
like Sophie's Choice.
Like Sophie's Choice, yeah. And the harsh judgment of the community on her, and the pain and the tragedy, and the fact that everything going on around her is, it's just, but you're right, I mean, it's an excellent comparison. Other, PG, you had?
Oh, no, she kind of answered my question.
Okay. Yes,
People
sir.
in the front talk louder or stand up. It's hard to hear.
Oh, when people ask questions?
Yes, we hear from you.
Okay.
Oh, I didn't ask a question. What?
I would like to hear what you have to say.
We're all getting older back here. We can't hear as well.
I have
Okay.
excellent hearing.
Okay. Yeah. So, with your experience in the community, I'm just curious to know, how are you able to maintain the relationships even after you've done interviews? I think that's the one thing that's fascinated me the most. Is the thief in the night academic tradition has been to come in, do interviews, and leave and not return, because people still have to deal with those lives, and 45 minutes and moving on is easy for the interviewer who gets to go back to an air-conditioned campus. But I'm just curious to know how, Dr. Ortiz and others who have been able to maintain a relationship genuine enough to do other things that are actually going on today. Like, we were in the mayor's house, Dr. Ortiz provided us opportunity, and they were talking about like current issues that people are doing now, and I thought that was interesting. So yeah. I wonder, how were you able, and others like you, to maintain relationships?
That's a really good question. I'll be very concise. Stacy White, Margaret Block. In this context here, to work with local leaders, local people, local organizers, when you ride around in a van with Margaret Block, doors are open to you that you don't even know exist. The respect that people have for Margaret in this entire region, we pull into a town like Glendora, Mississippi, which has an Emmett Till Museum, and the mayor comes out and embraces Margaret, right? And she's the person that is our guide and our mentor. And I think the answer to your question is you have to be willing to be guided and mentored. You can't be that traditional academic. I mean, Stacy White is my teacher, and Dorsey White is my teacher. Now, I don't know what educational opportunities Mr. White had, but he's much wiser than I am. He's had to live as a black man in the United States. I hate to ask how.
For many years.
For many years. I mean, I can spend the rest of my life in the archives of the library. I'll never have that kind of wisdom. So that's those are some kind of responses. I mean, that's the kind of behavior we try to model in the oral history world. I don't want to critique other academics, but some of them have done things like come into a community, get interviews, publish a dissertation, publish a book, even create a documentary film, and you never hear from them again. When we were doing the field work in '93, a lot of local communities would tell us that. They'd say, well, there's a young man from Harvard or Emory or someplace that was here 10 years ago and talked to a bunch of us, wrote down a lot of notes, and said, see you later. And we never heard from him again. It takes a lot of resources to maintain contact, time and energy and things like that. But to me, it's like a moral imperative as much as you can. So now, but I'm only one person. That's why I bring all these students. So now, you can do this work of keeping in contact and texting. I hear, Margaret, you've been texting people back and forth. I don't even have texting on my phone. Margaret Block has it. Yes, sir.
I want to ask, first thing, do you have like disclaimers? Do you have to know, even though when you're doing an oral interview, because for me, something that happened 40 years ago, that I deal with some people who were there as far as present in the community, and sometimes the names they give were not actual names of the people who made the historical impact.
Yes.
So are there sometimes disclaimers so people understand that it's so important to read many, many pieces,
Yes.
and to get information from many pieces? That's the one thing I was going to ask. So as a disclaimer, only because having lived in the community, having been a part of something, come back, and later there are names thrown out there. Unfortunately, you realize those weren't the proper names. You don't say they're incorrect. I don't tell them that. But I just wonder that, do you do that?
Yes.
Okay.
And I'm glad you asked the question. Oral history, see, normally when we teach history, we talk about a thing called objectivity. I'm not sure. The older I get, the less I know what that word really means, maybe. But the great thing about oral history is every good oral history book is going to have an introduction which talks about some of the themes that you're raising. And one of them is we say, oral history is all about subjectivity. It's all about individual and sometimes even group memories of events, and understanding that different people have different memories about events, right? One of the things that, remembering Jim Crow, that caused quite a stir when it was first released was the radio series has 4 parts to it. And part 3 is white people talking about their viewpoints about segregation. In this case, mainly white folks in New Iberia Parish, Louisiana, one of the most storied counties in American history. Huge plantation county, sugar, is the main crop, indigo, to a lesser extent. When the white individuals are talking about Jim Crow, their narrative is very different than the narratives that we've been talking about. Their narrative is, this was a great time for everyone. White people took care of everything. We took care of our colored people. They were happy. They would sing and dance. And I'm not making this up. You can listen to the excerpt. But we felt it was important to let them have that 15-minute segment because we wanted people to hear what they were saying. Because again, without that, and on the editorial team, when we were putting that documentary together, and we had to vote in every chapter and every excerpt, I voted against that. I said, I don't want to hear that. That's what I grew up hearing all the time. I said, I want this to just be African American voices. And I lost that vote, and I'm glad I did. Because when people, again, hear that 15-minute excerpt from it, well, it's actually 12 minutes, and 3 minutes for commercials, so on and so forth. But when they hear that, wow. And a man who's saying, you know, slavery was such a great thing for people. You know, it's like, wow. But it's so, that's what I mean, it's subjective. And we say there are many different truths, and sometimes we'll find mistakes. The 4th edition there were some typos, you know, so we corrected those. But yeah, subjectivity is where that's the water that we swim in as oral historians. And that makes it complicated. Yes, sir.
When you were talking about we were saying that we were happy, you know, just a couple of months ago, the guy from Duck Dynasty said the same thing.
Yeah.
Said that we were happy, you know.
And man, you know, right when he said that, I knew that. I knew the fix was in, and what I mean by this is that they tried. I never watched that program, but they tried to make it seem like he was this kind of poor white man who came up from a trailer park. And I told my friends, I said, "This is a wealthy guy." And then they later on found out he invented his identity. He actually came from a pretty good middle class, because that's what wealthy.
Who are we talking about?
The guy from Duck Dynasty who said, black people were happy during slavery times, right? Is that?
No, during Jim Crow.
Or during Jim Crow, I'm sorry, yeah.
They spent 1950s in Louisiana.
See,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you understand.
more sense than
Yeah.
Yeah, I know what you're
But,
talking about. He looks
yeah.
like a thug.
I never watched the show, but you're right. It's still Other question, yes, ma'am.
How do you decide to present the material? Because by cutting it up this way, I've just looked at the book, which looks wonderful. You've got disembodied voices who you don't know, as opposed to presenting a longer narrative. So how do you balance that contrast?
Being on the editorial team, and it was a collaborative process. Each of us took a chapter. In my case, the chapters I wrote the Heritage and Memory chapter and the chapter on work. We would come together every week at editorial team meetings, and we had to figure out. I mean, we couldn't run an entire interview. That was just too long. We were trying to keep attention spans, and it was challenging. And I think we made some mistakes. Or maybe not mistakes, but we made some decisions. We always had to think about the audience. What we were worried about is, okay, it's by the time we were working on the book, it was around 1998, 99. What kind of stories can we present in such a way that in a page and a half, they tell a story that people can understand?
The essence.
What's that?
The essence.
The essence. But in doing that, we missed a lot of things. Again, 1,600 interviews, and we only used about 70 of them. So we barely scratched the surface of this incredibly rich collection. So that's my kind of elliptical response to your question, which is that there's a lot of silences in the book. It's very selective in the sense that, they gave us a page, length. We tried to talk about Black working class experiences more than had been done previously. So there's a lot of interviews with people who are coal miners, domestic workers, and those were really, to my mind, the richest narratives. We didn't exclude, middle class narratives, but we interviewed, for example, Leon Alexander. I did that interview in Birmingham. He was a man who was 6'6", 280. Started a coal mine coal in 1928 until his father had been blacklisted and shot during the 1922. We interviewed a lot of African American miners whose fathers had been gunned down during the 1922 coal strike in Birmingham. This is an epic battle in labor history. And he strode into the room, and the first thing he said was, "You hear tell of all those CIO unions, Walter Reuther." He mentioned Walter Reuther's name. We saw him last night in the documentary. He said, "We created that all down here." So the black miners were the ones that created the CIO. He said, "You all don't even know that, do you?" He said, "You're always looking up at Detroit and Michigan and New York." He said, "We are the ones that were shot down here in the 20s and 30s." So that, but again, that's just one narrative. I mean, there are many other stories.
To follow up, what else I'm sorry I was late. This enormous project that you're doing, what are the students doing? What other things are coming in?
Yeah.
Maybe they would balance the limited part.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked the question. There are a number of different books now that have come out that have used those interviews. One is by Leslie Brown and Annie Wall, who were my graduate coordinators. They were 2 or 3 years ahead of me in grad school. And Leslie Brown and Annie Wall wrote a wonderful book a few years ago called Women in Jim Crow. And it's explicitly about women's narratives and voices. It was published by Paul Grade Macmillan. And again, Leslie Brown and Annie Wall, I can read the citation. But that book really deals in depth with issues of gender, of class. Remembering Jim Crow has some of that in there, but that wasn't our explicit. And then there are other books too. There are books like Mike Honey, my colleague who teaches at the University of Washington. Mike published a book called Black Workers Remember, and that book is almost exclusively about Black rural workers, i.e. sharecroppers, tenant farmers, but also black industrial workers, because they have important stories to tell, like in cities like Memphis, Birmingham, New Orleans, dock workers, and such. But it's just the richness of African American history. African American history is, I would say, the most popular branch of American history right now. Every year I get an offer to go teach in Japan. Up in the University of Osaka, they're like, hey, you have an open invitation to come and teach in Japan. I mean, there are Black Studies programs in every country now in Europe. Many of them. There are Black Studies conferences in Africa and Latin America. These are stories which have a local, a national resonance, but an international resonance. And now when you get to SNCC, my word, I mean, SNCC, the renaissance of attention in books and memoirs that are coming out about SNCC. The memoirs are really critical, by the way. And I know I've heard a lot of you talking about you're working on a memoir or maybe a narrative. Please move forward with it. And if we can be of any help at the Proctor program, just let us know. Those memoirs are what drive the larger literature. They're very, very important.
So what you're doing, Doctor, is you're using the tool of oral history in context of organizing community.
Yes.
You have pockets of community that you've built, and that's part of that subjectivity.
That's what we're trying. That's what we're trying to do.
I'm trying to get it right because you got a really special brand of doing it. And I really like it.
Look at who our teachers are again: Margaret Block, Stacy White, Lawrence Giot, Zahara Simmons, John Duke, Wright Wynn. I mean, these are people who we do interviews with, but also we do organizing workshops because we want the students to learn, well, how did people do this in SNCC in the early 60s? The same age, you being the same age that our students are now. Because sometimes, I mean, our students are brought up to believe that they can't really do much in terms of changing the system until they're older, right? And so that's one of the things that they learn talking to people like you and people like Margaret. The courage, the persistence, the willingness to go door to door to talk with people, whether it's political organizing or just building community together.
And with that, we're going to make those our concluding remarks. Thank you all for coming. We do have books available for purchase at the back. Books were written about Freedom Summer. I'm not going to read them all. We're going to invite you to the tables. We also have refreshments outside, so please mix and mingle if you're able to, stay longer. We encourage you to do so. Thank you all for coming, and for those
Thank
of you who
you.
must
Thank you.
leave, enjoy the conference in Jackson.
Oh, that's right. Jackson.